Hello, and welcome to Out West, the official podcast of the Western Governors Association, a bipartisan organization representing the governors of the 22 westernmost states and territories. I'm Jim Ogsbury, Executive Director of WGA. COVID-19 has had disproportionate impacts on people with disabilities. It has also changed the work landscape in ways that present both challenges and opportunities for disability employment. Today's workplace is much different from what it was just a year ago, and it continues to change and evolve rapidly and dramatically. This episode of Out West discusses how the pandemic has affected the workforce and how to ensure an inclusive economic recovery for all Americans. WGA Policy Advisor Lauren Cloward speaks with Andrew Houtenville, Research Director of the University of New Hampshire's Institute on Disability, and Jill Houghton, President and CEO of Disabiity In. They explore workforce trends and considerations for employers as people return to work and adapt to a new work environment.
Great. Well, Andrew and Jill, thank you so much for joining us today. Andrew, let's start off by having you tell us a little bit about the Institute on Disability and your research at the University of New Hampshire.
Thank you for having me. So the University of New Hampshire has an Institute on Disability, which is about 100 people doing various disability-related activities, training, technical assistance, research, service, working with schools, working with various organizations and individuals throughout the state, but we also have a national presence as well. In terms of our research as it relates to people with disabilities and employment, we have been fortunate enough to be awarded funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. So that's a lot of words. So NIDLR. So it's a research institute that funds universities and advocacy organizations and various groups across the country to do research on employment, independent living, and health of people with disabilities. And so our research, we have kind of a two-prong attack when it comes to research. A lot of it is revolving around national statistics, using Census Bureau, Center for Disease Control, National Center for Health Statistics, all kinds of survey data, to try to get a picture of the employment situation for people with disabilities. And it's really, we do a lot of, the two prongs are, one is to do research with those data files to look for patterns and trends, and to try to find, the ultimate thing is to try to find causal effects of, say, policies or specific occurrences. So that's the research side. And then we have an outreach side, which provides statistics on a monthly basis. The other thing we do is we provide a lot of assistance to others who are looking for statistics. So we'll get calls from the offices of senators and House of representatives, state officials, county, city officials looking for statistics about employment in their area. And so we really try to push a level of awareness, in our work. And the first level is awareness. Then we try to support availability, and then we try to support the community with research findings about what could be done to improve the employment outcomes of people with disabilities. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks for that. And how does that better, data collection and research lead to those outcomes for disability employment?
Yeah, so, with any kind of research or data collection, it's not directly impacting, right? So it's not actually helping an individual find a job at an individual employer. But as I mentioned earlier, the first level is awareness. So a lot of individuals that we work with are trying to help make the case to their local officials or federal officials or new appointees in an administration, trying to make the case for the employment of people with disabilities to receive attention. I remember years ago when Chief Justice Roberts was being interviewed by senators, before his confirmation, we were providing statistics about the employment of people with disabilities because issues around the ADA were going to come up. So that's one way that it helps to provide that awareness, but also, as I mentioned earlier, just making it available to people to use. Making it available to companies. Some of the statistics we've worked on are working with the U.S. Bar Association, working with veterans groups to kind of tease out and generate customized statistics that would help them make the case that they're trying to make to draw attention to the employment of people with disabilities.
Great. And with that, let's turn it over to Jill. Jill, can you tell us a little bit about your company and what you do there?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. Disability In is a global nonprofit, and we empower over 250 really multinational brands around achieving disability inclusion and equality. We do that through a wide variety of programs, things like the Disability Equality Index. That's a benchmarking tool to really help companies identify opportunities where they can make improvements related to disability inclusion, or programs like our program Inclusion Works. That's a peer-to-peer community really focused on driving disability inclusion. And I would just tell you that everything that we do at Disability In is focused on the role that we all have to play in building an inclusive global economy where people with disabilities participate fully and meaningfully.
It's great to hear. And I think looking specifically at, COVID and what's going on with the current health crisis, why are people with disabilities disproportionately affected? What have you guys seen in your work? And I'll open it up to both of you.
So during the pandemic, people with disabilities, workers with disabilities have been hurt really hard, just like everyone else. I think what we're seeing is, a lot of the economic impact was really at the very, very beginning, right? When we didn't have masks, we didn't have PPE, we had the national shutdown, right? And, I don't know about other organizations, but the University of Hampshire was scrounging around for plexiglass to separate people at windows, and shopping around for sanitizer and shields and all kinds of stuff. That economic impact was really the big hit back in April. And what's really been happening is we've been kind of recovering since, right? And also battling the current outbreak and the summer outbreak in the southern part of the country. I think as an economy, we've gotten better at handling, the shutdowns and shutting down specific sectors or parts of the country or parts of a state. So the economic impacts aren't as deep. But I think we really are still recovering from that initial hit in April. And from the statistics that I've been tracking with Kessler Foundation through the National Trends in Disability Employment webcast that we do, is that people with disabilities are slower to recover. That just like we saw with the Great Recession, people with disabilities are either in jobs or themselves are not being recalled as fast as people without disabilities. I think both groups got really hit hard, but people with disabilities are kind of re-entering the workspace slower, and that's a concern. And because it was really something we saw in the Great Recession, that people with disabilities lost their jobs at around the same rate as people without disabilities, but were slower to recover, slower to re-engage into the workforce.
And Andrew, why do you think that is? Why do you think that for people with disabilities, that recovery is slower?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of reasons. I don't know for sure, right? I don't know. The data is not collected in that amount of detail. What I would suspect is that many jobs are kind of crafted, just like everyone else. We're kind of we get into a job, we kind of start customizing it for ourselves. For people with disabilities, that may mean accommodations or alternative arrangements. And when a person loses their job, or maybe even goes out on furlough, temporarily losing their job, it may be harder to get back to that crafted situation, right? And so those kinds of accommodations and patterns of work are potentially not feasible in COVID-restricted environments, and or just maybe difficult to rebuild them after they've been broken. I have a colleague who works in the hospitality industry, and we had a major employer basically cut their workforce down, 90% cut in their workforce. And you talk to the current employees, and they're doing all the jobs, right? Their jobs, the current employees that were lucky enough to keep their jobs are still doing all kinds of jobs. And so the job arrangements at companies, particularly hard-hit industries, are really kind of resorting things. And it may be more difficult for people with disabilities to get the accommodations and the arrangements that they need to succeed.
Thanks. And Jill, from your perspective and in your work, does that resonate with you? Why do you think that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected in this recovery?
So I'm not a researcher like Andrew, much more an anecdotal. I think when we think about people with disabilities and we look and we realize that, just in the US alone, that 1 in 4 Americans have a disability, or if we look around the globe and we know that 15% of the population has a disability. And in fact, because of COVID, that number's probably going to grow, right? Because disability, we're learning, is becoming, could become a result of COVID. So it's possible that our population is going to grow in terms of people with disabilities. I think people with disabilities have been disproportionately affected, like even before there was a global pandemic. And the global pandemic perhaps becomes even more of a challenge as we work in a remote manner, et cetera. So if you think about how in March, many industries moved into that remote workforce, well, that becomes like an opportunity to look at the technology that we're using, right? And is the technology that we're using accessible? And in many cases, it's not. And so it becomes a barrier. So if we think about people like our board chair at Disability Inn, Jenny LeFleury, who's deaf and the chief accessibility officer at Microsoft, she obviously works in an environment where they're driving the accessibility of technology and making sure that products are accessible to all people. But I think she'd be the first to tell you that it's a journey, and that even with their products, they're not 100% there yet. And so I think that people with disabilities have been disproportionately affected by this global pandemic, and it has really presented an opportunity for us to try to advance the work around accessibility, not just of the physical space, right, but of the remote workplace and technology that we're using.
Yeah, Jill, that's a really great point. And I think, obviously that's where the workplace and the workforce is trending, is kind of towards this virtual, increased use of technology. But I think we're seeing a huge acceleration in that with the pandemic. So, I think that's a great point to be made. And Andrew, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier when you were talking about your research at the Institute, but beyond kind of this slower recovery, are there other trends that you're seeing or you're expecting to see as the pandemic continues?
Yeah. So one of the things early on that I was concerned about and have been watching is the degree to which people with disabilities and without disabilities leave the labor market altogether. So they stop looking for work. So unemployment, if you don't know, unemployment is the percentage of people who are looking for work or on temporary layoff as a percentage of all workers, right? But you can also leave the labor force if you're not actively engaged or not expected to be recalled. You can leave the labor force. And traditionally, it's very hard to come back into the labor force. The longer you're out of the labor force, the harder it is to come back in, right? It's called scarring in the labor economics literature. And a big concern early on was, okay, if this is like the Great Recession and people with disabilities aren't furloughed and aren't looking for work and they leave the work job permanently, that could affect their ability to come back in when the economy and when COVID is, in our rear view mirror. So I've been tracking that, and honestly, it's been really good news that people with disabilities are staying engaged, right? They are less likely to be furloughed nowadays and more likely to be actively looking for work than they were early on in the COVID pandemic. However, they're staying engaged, actually more so than people without disabilities. And that could be, while I say it's a good trend, right? It still could be signs of very difficult times. It could mean that many people are coming into the labor force previously were out because their families are struggling. So I'm not saying that it's a good story. I'm just saying it's a good sign that people are engaged and remaining engaged, more so than people without disabilities, which is actually really good. So it's still something that's a big concern, especially as this next round of, as shutdowns are starting to happen again with this latest spike. It's something that's really going to need to be looked at carefully. I also get concerned that people will start depending on longer term benefits like Social Security disability insurance benefits and supplemental security income benefits. Now, those benefits are there for a reason, and they're to help people. But there's also the potential that if you're in those long-term benefits, that you may not get out, right? You may stay with those benefits, and going back to work threatens those benefits potentially. And that's why, the stimulus packages and keeping the unemployment insurance side of things running, this whole time is really helpful, because those are temporary benefits and are designed to kind of support people moving back into employment. The idea early on, and I'm not sure where it stands right at the moment, that people who have secondary conditions who put them at risk of COVID could potentially not go back to work, even though their job was reopened, but because they're in personal danger of dying from COVID or extreme complications due to COVID, they were allowed to receive unemployment insurance. I haven't seen where that is in the current pantheon of legislation, but I thought that was a really good idea, because it keeps people with secondary conditions and potentially disabilities from moving into more longer term benefits that are harder to get to move off of.
Let's turn it over to Jill now. Jill, do some of those trends that Andrew was explaining, do those track with what you're seeing in the businesses you work with? What have been kind of their one or two top challenges in maintaining inclusive workplaces that you've seen as we go through this transition?
Yeah, I think everything that Andrew is saying is obviously right on track. I think in terms of trends that we're seeing around top challenges, let's go back to accessibility. Let's use conferences as an example, right? We all, in every industry, have conferences, and we've had to pivot and make these things virtual. And there is not one platform out there that's 100% accessible. So that's a huge challenge. So when whether it's an industry or a company, they're having these meetings and they've got these avatars and all this cool interactive, ways to engage. Well, it's not cool and it's not interactive for all because it's not accessible. And so that's a huge challenge around creating an inclusive workplace.
But Jill, I know part of your work is helping businesses benchmark and measure success for disability inclusion. How do you think that those benchmarks will help businesses ensure that they don't move backwards in terms of disability inclusion as a result of COVID?
I think COVID and this pandemic has actually created an opportunity for companies to be more engaged and to get more individuals across the business that work in the different lines, different parts of the business, kind of more connected. Clearly, the greatest resource that companies have are their employee resource groups, right? And many companies have a disability employee resource group that they have engaged in working on the Disability Equality Index, which is a benchmarking tool that Disability:IN created in partnership with the American Association of People with Disabilities. And we actually used the pandemic as an opportunity to modernize the tool. So we worked together with people with disabilities and allies to lean in and look at things like it looks at 6 different categories. So it starts with culture and leadership, enterprise-wide access, employment practices, community engagement, supplier diversity, and non-US operations. And we modernized the tool by looking at like mental health, for example, and looking at the benefits subcategory, or digging into the enterprise-wide access accessibility questions. And so the 2021 tool has actually been modernized as a result of the pandemic. And the pandemic has created an opportunity for companies to be more engaged in using this as a tool, really to identify ways that they can do better, right? It's a carrot and not a stick, looks beyond compliance, is a voluntary opportunity for them to find ways that they can do better around disability inclusion.
Accommodations are obviously an important part of having people with disabilities stay in a job and then also having them return to work. And what are some actions and accommodations that both states and businesses can implement so that people with disabilities are able to work safely and they don't leave their jobs, and are able to stay in the workforce?
Yeah, so one of the top accommodations, at least in the research, and this research is kind of old, it's going back to the 2000s, late 90s, when people were first starting to look at the impact of accommodations in relation to the start of the ADA, was that flexible work hours was really an important aspect of work that allowed people to adjust in many, many ways. And that was one thing that really came out in the research. In terms of now in the COVID environment, I think a dedication to a healthy environment, a healthy workspace is going to be needed, because many people do have either their primary condition or their secondary health conditions could put them at risk of COVID. And I think COVID's going to be around for a while, or the risk of COVID will be around for quite a while. One thing that I've seen employers do is a person who is susceptible to high risk of COVID infection and complications can change to the front of the front of the house to the back of the house, so to speak. not deal directly with customers, but work in the back of the facility doing some other job. And I've seen anecdotally, I've seen that happen frequently when it's good enough. When people are lucky enough to have the company open. But that's one way of helping people reduce risk who may be susceptible.
Agreed. And Jill, do you have anything to add there? What sorts of accommodations are businesses taking, and what other actions kind of at the state policy level would really help accelerate some of those actions or accommodations?
I think that states and business, that the greatest resource that all of those entities have are their people. And it's incumbent upon them to work directly with their employees, specifically their employees who identify as having disabilities and their employees who identify as being allies of individuals with disabilities, and really work together with your people to identify what the issues are, what the opportunities are, kind of where to move forward. I think that on the accommodation front, people need to know what the policy is, how to find it, how to access it. Managers need to know what it is, how to pay for things. Your people need to know how to connect with your communities, with your employee resource groups. I think it's an opportunity to prioritize mental health, to lead with humanity, and to prioritize digital accessibility. Clearly, the physical space is an equally important issue that's not fully solved, but COVID has really created a tipping point for us to recognize that the digital space also needs to be accessible.
Yeah, I agree with Jill's comments wholeheartedly. I want to kind of piggyback on what she said about mental health and the priority towards mental health. Mental health is many times an invisible disability. You don't know it's there. I think that many times people don't disclose it, right, because of potential stigma. And I think that supervisors and employers and coworkers have a difficult time talking about it because it's not something they're used to talking about in the workplace. And I know that at universities and working with students, we're starting to receive training on how to talk about it openly and without stigma, and how to accommodate individuals with mental health conditions. And I think that that's something that employers can do. And certainly the shared anxiety of everyone around COVID could be a nice launching point into talking about health and mental health in the workplace.
Yeah, I agree, Andrew. And as you had mentioned, mental illness, a lot of times mental health is an invisible disability. And so like Jill was saying, having that personal connection with your employees is obviously very important and critical, especially during these times, because there are disabilities that you aren't necessarily able to see outright either. And with that, Jill, what are a few examples of the accommodations and the actions that you've seen businesses take?
I think that people are taking no meeting Fridays to help with mental health. You're seeing companies put parameters around the length of time for meetings, making accommodations around, when you start and when you finish your day. And so, I think that there's a lot going on around flexibility in the workplace, around creating additional benefits.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you guys both so much for coming on today and sharing your expertise. Really appreciate all the work that you do in this space, and thanks so much for sharing.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Out West, presented in partnership with the State Exchange on Employment and Disability. The State Exchange, known as SEED, is funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, which assists states in developing effective and inclusive workplace policies. SEED recently launched the COVID-19 Policy Collaborative for an Inclusive Recovery. ODEP also funds the Job Accommodation Network, the leading source of free, expert, confidential guidance on workplace accommodations and disability employment issues. To learn more about their ongoing work on disability employment, please visit dol.gov and askjan.org. WGA would like to thank Andrew Houtenville and Jill Houghton for sharing their expertise on disability employment for today's episode. And be sure to join us next time as we continue to discuss critical issues facing the Western United States. Happy trails, everyone.